Before we start tonight's story, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Drop a comment below, and if you're enjoying the stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Lisa and Mark couldn't believe their luck when they found their dream home. Nestled on the edge of a quiet, forgotten street, the house stood tall and proud, its century-old frame brimming with untold stories. It was everything they had imagined. With its creaking floors and faded charm, they saw the potential for a warm, welcoming home where they could start fresh. The basement, dark and untouched, seemed like the perfect canvas for their biggest dream yet. They pictured a cozy lounge, a place to escape the world. They could already imagine themselves sitting on plush sofas, the soft glow of lights illuminating the space as they relaxed, away from the hustle of everyday life. The old stone walls, while damp and worn, were full of character, and the couple was eager to get started. Excitement filled the air as they unpacked boxes and began planning the renovations. Lisa could already see the basement transformed. Fresh paint, comfortable furniture, a warm atmosphere where they'd spend countless evenings together. Mark, eager to dive in, started clearing away the years of dust and debris. It felt like the beginning of something new, but amidst their excitement, there was an unsettling stillness in the house, an unspoken tension in the air that they couldn't quite place. It was almost as if the house itself was watching them, waiting for something. But with every brushstroke, with every piece of furniture moved into place, they brushed the feeling aside, focusing only on their vision. Little did they know, the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. Beneath the layers of dust and decay, something old, something dark, was stirring, and it would soon make itself known. It was late one night when Lisa first heard it. She had been working alone in the basement, brushing the dust off the old beams above her head, trying to make sense of the mess they had inherited. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. But then, in the silence, a sound emerged, a faint whisper. At first, it was so soft she could have sworn it was the wind or the house settling, as old houses do. She paused, straining her ears to listen, but the sound was gone. Just the house, she thought to herself, shaking her head. But the feeling of unease lingered, crawling under her skin like a slow-growing chill. The next night, it happened again. This time, the whispers were clearer, more distinct, almost like a soft murmur in the distance. Lisa froze, her hand gripping the handle of the paintbrush tightly. The words, though muffled, seemed to come from somewhere deep within the basement, somewhere dark. She told herself it was just her imagination, the house playing tricks on her after a long day of work. But the whispers didn't stop. Every night, they grew louder, creeping into her thoughts like a constant presence. And each night, they seemed to call her name. Lisa. The voice was faint at first, almost like a whisper from another room. But tonight, it sounded closer, right behind her. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She spun around, expecting to see Mark standing there. But the basement was empty. Only the shadows, stretching long and dark, stared back at her. Still, the whispers echoed through the room, clearer than ever. Lisa, Lisa. Her skin prickled with a growing sense of dread. The feeling of being watched was undeniable now. It wasn't just the house. Something else was there, something that was waiting for her to listen. Nights in the basement had become unbearable for Lisa. The whispers, once faint and distant, now seemed to echo through the very walls, growing louder, more desperate. Lisa, Lisa. The voice that called her name was no longer soft, but filled with an almost pleading tone, as if it was trying to get her attention, trying to warn her of something she couldn't understand. One evening, unable to shake the chill that had settled over her, Lisa finally confided in Mark. Mark, I can't ignore it anymore. The whispers, they're calling my name. It's like they're coming from the walls, from the shadows themselves. Mark, though concerned, tried to calm her down. "It's just your imagination, Lisa. This house is old. You've been working too hard, that's all." But the fear in Lisa's eyes made him hesitate. He didn't want to believe her, but a small part of him wondered if she was right. That night, Mark made a decision. He would go down into the basement alone, try to prove to Lisa that there was nothing to fear. But as soon as he stepped onto the cold stone floor, the air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. He could hear them almost immediately, the whispers. They weren't Lisa's name this time. They were his. "Mark, Mark," the voice, now louder and more urgent, seemed to come from all directions at once. He spun around, his heart racing. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just the house. But then, the voice grew clearer, right behind him. "Mark," the tone was darker now, sharper. Terrified, Mark turned to face the shadows, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. But there was nothing there, only the suffocating silence of the basement. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He could feel it now, the oppressive presence in the room, as if something unseen was closing in on him, just waiting to strike. With panic gripping his chest, Mark rushed up the stairs, stumbling out of the basement, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "It's real, Lisa. It's real." He didn't need to say more. The terror in his eyes said it all. The house had something dark, and it was awake. The terror that had taken root in their home was undeniable. Lisa and Mark could no longer ignore the whispers, the way the shadows seemed to move on their own, the sensation of being watched at every turn. They knew they had to uncover the truth. There was no turning back now. One evening, as they stood in the basement, the oppressive silence surrounding them, Lisa noticed something strange. Against the far wall, almost hidden by the darkness, there was a faint outline, a door. At first, she thought it was just an old crack in the stone, a trick of the light. But as she stepped closer, the outline became clearer. It wasn't just a crack. It was the shape of a door, barely visible under layers of dust and grime. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do you see this?" Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. He hadn't noticed it before. Neither of them had. And yet, there it was, an old door that had been hidden in plain sight. They pried it open, their hands trembling, hearts pounding in their chests. The hinges creaked as the door swung open, revealing a small, damp chamber beyond. Inside, an old wooden chest sat in the corner, its surface worn and scratched. Mark hesitated, but Lisa, drawn to the chest like a magnet, opened it. What she found inside was a tattered, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age and fragile to the touch. The diary seemed almost alive, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. With shaking hands, she opened the first page. The words were faded, but they were clear enough to read. The entries were from the perspective of a child who had been locked in the basement, forced to live in the darkness, alone, until death claimed them. "Day 1, I'm scared. The voices are getting louder. I think they want me to stay here forever." Lisa's voice faltered as she read aloud, but she couldn't stop. The story unfolded, piece by piece, how the child had been locked away in the basement, abandoned by their family, left to die in isolation. The whispers, the cold, the desperation, they all made sense now. The voices were the child's, forever echoing in the darkness, trapped between life and death. As Lisa closed the diary, she felt an icy chill wrap around her. The whispers began again, louder, more frantic this time, as if the child's spirit was pleading for release. They had uncovered the truth, but in doing so, they had awoken something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. As Lisa finished reading the last chilling words from the diary, a sudden shift in the air sent a shiver down her spine. The whispers, once soft and faint, now surged, growing in volume, in desperation. The words weren't just whispers anymore. They were screams. The child's voice, filled with agony and rage, echoed around them. "Help me! Let me out!" The basement, once dark and still, seemed to come alive. The temperature dropped, the air thick with a biting cold that cut through them like ice. Lisa could see her breath misting in front of her as she looked around, but it wasn't just the chill that terrified her. It was the shadows. They moved. No, they lurched, twisting and writhing across the walls like living things, hungry and reaching out for them. Mark stumbled back, his eyes wide with horror. "We have to get out of here, Lisa." But the door, the way out, seemed to grow farther with each step they took. The room, the basement, had become a maze of dark shapes and eerie figures. The walls seemed to close in around them, pressing down on their chests as the child's screams grew louder, more frantic. The shadows swirled faster now, their edges becoming sharper, more defined. Something was moving. Something unseen was lurking just beyond a corner of their vision. Lisa could feel it, like cold fingers brushing against her skin. Something, or someone was in the basement with them. "Lisa, we have to leave. Now!" Mark shouted, pulling her toward the stairs. But as they turned, the whispers reached a crescendo. The voice was no longer pleading. It was screaming, wailing in torment, filling their ears, their minds, with a primal fear. "No, no, please don't leave me here." The cold was unbearable now, a suffocating presence that made it feel as if the very walls of the house were closing in on them. Their feet pounded up the stairs, but the screams followed them, echoing in their minds, in the very fabric of the house. They didn't look back. They couldn't. They ran, leaving behind everything they had worked for, everything they had dreamed of. As the door slammed shut behind them, the house fell silent. But the whispers didn't stop. The echoes of that tortured soul, trapped between life and death, would remain forever within those walls, forever calling out to anyone who would listen, forever haunting the basement, waiting for the next unwitting soul to enter, to discover its secrets, to awaken the screams once again. The house would never be free, and neither would they. The house stood as a beautiful relic of the past, with its towering windows and intricate woodwork. To Emma and Jake, it was perfect. The large, sprawling rooms and the promise of a fresh start filled them with excitement. They couldn't wait to begin their new life here, making memories in each corner of the house that felt like it held 1,000 untold stories. The basement in particular caught their attention. It was vast, perfect for a home office, a recreation room, maybe even a studio. As they toured the house, their imaginations ran wild with possibilities, and they saw nothing but promise in the space. But there was one thing, just one thing, that unsettled them, a strange, flickering light in the basement. It was nothing too extreme at first, just a slight flicker now and then, as if the bulb wasn't securely in place. They didn't think much of it. Old houses had their quirks, but as the days passed, the flickering grew more persistent. It became a nuisance, distracting them from the joy of moving in. They replaced the bulb, thinking it was just a faulty light, but the new bulb did nothing to fix the issue. The light continued to flicker, blinking on and off, sometimes even staying on for hours at a time, even when no one was down there. Jake shrugged it off. "It's an old house, Em. Maybe there's a wiring issue or something. We'll get it checked out tomorrow." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the light. There was a presence down there, in the basement, lurking in the shadows. She'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, feel a chill in the air, as if something or someone was watching her. Still, they carried on, trying to push the odd occurrences aside. But as the light flickered on once more, Emma couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease in her gut. There was something more to this old house than they had first realized, and whatever it wasn't going to let them ignore it for long. Days turned into weeks, and Emma and Jake tried to settle into their new life, but the basement light continued its maddening dance. No matter how many times they switched it off, the next morning it would be glowing again, flickering faintly, as though the house itself refused to let the darkness in. Emma, growing increasingly frustrated, would climb the stairs each night, flick the switch, and ensure the light stayed off. But by morning, it was on again. Sometimes it was bright, other times it was just a faint, buzzing glow. It didn't matter. The basement light refused to stay off. Maybe we just need to get an electrician to check the wiring, Jake suggested one evening, his voice trailing off as he watched Emma stare uneasily at the stairs leading down to the basement. It's not the wiring, Jake. I've turned it off myself so many times. It's like something's making it stay on. Her words hung in the air, thick with unease. There was no logical explanation for it. It didn't make sense. The light's behavior was too deliberate, too persistent. Sometimes it would flicker in a strange pattern, like a message being sent from the shadows. Emma swore she saw shadows moving beneath the flickering light, and at night, when they lay in bed, a strange feeling would wash over her, as if the house itself was awake, watching them. There was a presence in the basement, a cold, creeping sensation that lingered long after the light had switched off. Late one night, unable to sleep, Emma decided to check again. She descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking beneath her feet. Her heart raced as she approached the basement light, glowing faintly in the dark. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel it in her bones. She flicked the switch down, expecting silence, but the light didn't fade. It flickered once, twice, and then stayed on. A sickly green hue seemed to pulse from it, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Something was down there with her, something that was feeding off her fear. She backed away slowly, eyes locked on the basement, until her feet hit the stairs. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the light flickered once more. This time, it blinked rapidly as if in warning. She ran back up the stairs, heart pounding in her chest. The house was watching, and whatever was in that basement wasn't ready to let them leave just yet. Emma and Jake could no longer deny it. There was something wrong with their new home. The light's behavior had become an obsession, gnawing at the edges of their sanity. They couldn't explain it, but they knew one thing. They had to find out what was going on. They called in an electrician, hoping he could finally put their fears to rest. Maybe it was just a wiring issue. Maybe they were overthinking things. But as the electrician made his way down into the basement, something told Emma that they were about to discover more than they had bargained for. The man, a grizzled older man with deep-set eyes, studied the old wires, muttering to himself. He checked the main wiring, poked around the fuse box, but nothing stood out as particularly alarming. Then, as his flashlight flickered in the dim light, he stopped. "Hold on a minute," he said, his voice low and thick with uncertainty. Emma and Jake exchanged glances. The electrician was standing at the far corner of the basement, staring intently at a series of tangled wires. "What is it?" Jake asked, his voice trembling with apprehension. "Look here," the electrician said, his finger pointing to an old wire, disconnected from any visible source. It was old, rusted, frayed at the edges, and it led to a part of the wall Emma and Jake had never noticed before. It wasn't marked on any of the house's blueprints, and there was no indication of what it could be connected to. But the most disturbing part was this. The wire led downward, behind a section of wall that seemed oddly out of place. As the electrician examined the area more closely, he discovered a narrow, hidden door, one that seemed to have been bricked up and forgotten by time. Emma's pulse quickened as the electrician pried open the hidden door, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading further down, into a second, unseen basement. They had never been told about a second basement. It wasn't on the house's plans. They had never noticed any signs of it. No vents, no windows, nothing. It had been hidden from them, like a secret that had been buried away for years. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread filling the air, something pulled them toward the staircase. Something they couldn't explain. The light flickered again, casting long shadows across the walls of the first basement, drawing their attention to the unseen door. And despite every warning in their minds, they felt a strange, irresistible compulsion to follow it, into the darkness of the unknown. They stepped forward, the air growing colder with each step they took. The whisper of the past seemed to call them downward, beckoning them closer to the hidden basement below. What had been locked away for so long? And why was the house so desperate to keep it hidden from them? The narrow stairs creaked under their weight as Emma and Jake descended deeper into the hidden basement, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The air grew colder with each step, and a suffocating heaviness settled over them. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to discover the dark secrets it had buried for so long. The basement was unlike anything they had imagined. It was far smaller than the one they had explored before, but the oppressive darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. They stumbled forward, guided only by the eerie glow of the flickering light behind them, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Then they saw it. In the center of the room, a strange altar stood, an ancient stone structure covered in the remnants of burnt candles, their wax long since hardened into grotesque shapes. The air around it pulsed with a sickening energy, a sense of something alive. Symbols, scrawled in what looked like blood, were etched into the walls and floor around the altar, their meanings as unknowable as the horrors they hinted at. It was as if some dark ritual had taken place here, rituals that had summoned something far older and more terrifying than anything they could have ever imagined. But it was the glowing orb that truly froze their blood. It floated just above the altar, shimmering with an unnatural light. The orb flickered, casting an unsettling radiance on the symbols and the altar, like some ancient force was drawing its power from the darkness. Emma's pulse quickened. Something in the room was watching them. It was a presence so old, so powerful, that it felt as though the walls themselves were whispering their names, beckoning them closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a chill swept through her body, as if cold fingers had brushed against her skin. Jake reached out, his hand trembling, as he stepped closer to the altar. The moment his fingers neared the glowing orb, the light above them flickered violently, casting the basement into darkness for a brief moment. When the light returned, it wasn't the same. It was harsh, flashing in erratic patterns, as if warning them to leave, to turn back before it was too late. But they couldn't move. The pull of the orb, of whatever ancient force it contained, was too strong. The presence in the basement was growing, pressing in on them, suffocating them with its weight. They could feel it now, not just in the room, but within themselves, a creeping fear that threatened to consume them whole. The light flickered again, this time faster, like a heartbeat racing out of control. The ground beneath them trembled. Emma could hear something breathing, deep and ragged, as if something had awoken. Something hungry. They needed to leave. But the darkness, the presence, it wouldn't let them go. Panic surged through Emma and Jake as the ground beneath their feet trembled violently. The moment they turned to flee, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. They both spun around in horror, hands scrambling at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The thick wooden door was sealed tight, as though something, or someone, was holding it shut from the other side. Their breath came in shallow gasps, the cold air growing heavier with every passing second. The glowing orb above the altar pulsed faster now, its light growing brighter and more intense, casting sickly shadows across the walls, each flicker warping the reality around them. The light, this terrible, unyielding light, seemed to feed off their fear. It pressed down on them, suffocating them, as if it were alive. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, and the very air felt thick, like they were breathing water instead of air. Emma's pulse hammered in her ears, her chest tightening as she felt the suffocating weight of the darkness pressing in on her. She turned to Jake, his face pale and wide-eyed, his hand gripping hers in a desperate attempt to hold on. "We need to get out of here," Jake shouted, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence of the basement. But the more they tried to fight the panic, the worse the light became, its glow expanding like a living thing, crawling across the room and enveloping them in its terrible embrace. The whispers that had followed them since they first moved in were now loud and unrelenting, a chorus of tortured voices coming from the shadows, from the very walls of the basement itself. They could hear their own names being spoken, their own fears reflected back at them in garbled whispers. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to face it. Whatever it is, whatever's down here, we have to face it." The orb flickered brighter now, its light blinding. For a moment, Emma felt herself paralyzed, as if the light was reaching into her soul, pulling out every fear she had ever had, every nightmare, every dark thought, every moment of weakness she had ever felt was now surfacing, twisted into something monstrous. She could feel her grip on reality slipping. With a sudden, final burst, the light exploded in a flash of white-hot intensity. They were engulfed in it. It wasn't just light, it was alive, a force that bent time, space, and reason. Then, as quickly as it had come, the light snapped off, leaving them in complete darkness. The sound of breathing, their own, was deafening in the silence. But they weren't alone. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room. From nowhere and everywhere, a whisper they couldn't escape. "You shouldn't have come." And then, the darkness consumed them. The old farmhouse had charm. Emma and Ben had spent months searching for the perfect home for their family. Somewhere quiet, peaceful, and full of history. And this farmhouse seemed to fit all of those expectations. Surrounded by sprawling fields and distant woods, it was the perfect place to raise their children, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The house was spacious, with a large, unfinished basement. Emma had big plans for the space, an area for the kids to play, a place to store all the family's memories. But as they began to settle in, there was one thing they couldn't shake. It was the stain on the basement wall. At first, they thought it was just an old mark from years of neglect. The walls had been exposed to moisture, and with time, it had faded into a dark, blotchy splotch. But when Emma moved a few boxes around to get a better look, something caught her eye, a faint, almost imperceptible shape that didn't belong. She squinted at the wall, her heart skipping a beat. The stain seemed to form the shape of a face. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a collection of shadowed patches and uneven markings. But if you looked long enough, you could make out the outline of eyes and nose and a mouth, a face that seemed to stare back at her, waiting. Her breath caught in her throat. The face was eerie, unsettling, and something about it felt wrong. She quickly turned away and tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. She didn't mention it to Ben at first. She didn't want to worry him. They had just moved in, and there was so much to do. It was probably nothing, she reasoned. Just an old stain, a trick of the light. But every time she passed by the basement door, she felt her heart race, her eyes darting back to the wall, as if the face was still watching, waiting, following her every move. It wasn't just a stain. It felt like something more, like an invitation. And Emma couldn't shake the sense that something in that basement was calling to them. Days passed, and Emma tried to forget the eerie stain on the basement wall. She focused on unpacking, setting up the kids' rooms, and getting the house ready. But each time she passed the basement door, she couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling gnawing at her. At first, it was faint, a barely noticeable change. The face in the wall seemed to shift, just slightly. The shadows that had once been mere streaks began to form into something more distinct, more lifelike. The eyes, once blurry and unfocused, now stared back at her with a clarity that made her stomach tighten. They were empty, hollow, but somehow full of pain, unbearable sorrow. The nose, though still distorted, now had a shape, sharp and pointed, and the mouth looked like it was whispering, but there were no words, just an endless, silent scream. Emma tried to brush it off, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But every time she looked at the stain, she saw it, felt it, more than before. And what disturbed her most was that she wasn't the only one who noticed. One evening, Ben entered the basement to grab some tools. He froze at the bottom of the stairs, his eyes fixed on the wall. Emma, standing at the doorway, saw his face drain of color. "Ben," she called out softly. He didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the wall, his jaw clenched. "Ben," she asked again, more urgently. Slowly, he turned to her, his expression grim. "Emma, the face, it's changing. It's real. It's watching us." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stepped into the basement, her eyes unwillingly drawn to the wall. And she saw it too. The face wasn't just a stain anymore. It was an expression of anguish, of suffering. Its features were clearer now, more defined. The eyes were wide, pleading, and the mouth twisted in a silent, frozen scream. Every night, the face seemed to grow more vivid, more detailed, as if it were trying to break free from the wall. No matter where they stood in the basement, Emma and Ben couldn't escape its gaze. It was as though the face followed them, its eyes never leaving their movements. And with each passing day, the sense of dread grew stronger, an undeniable certainty that something was coming. Something dark and angry and ready to make itself known. It was no longer just a stain. It was a presence, a force that had claimed the wall as its own, and it was calling out to them. The presence of the face on the wall became an obsession for Emma and Ben. Each day, they found themselves unable to focus on anything else. It was always there, lurking in the corner of their minds, its hollow eyes watching, its tortured expression never leaving their thoughts. They had to know more. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma began digging into the house's history. Late one night, after the kids had gone to bed, she sat down with a stack of old records and newspapers she found in the attic. Ben joined her, flipping through dusty books of local lore, hoping to find some answers. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon an unsettling discovery. The farmhouse had once belonged to a man named Thomas Holden, a reclusive farmer who had lived there for nearly 30 years. But what caught their attention wasn't his life. It was his sudden, mysterious disappearance. According to the local news archives, Thomas had vanished without a trace one cold winter's night. There were no signs of struggle, no clues as to what had happened to him. His wife had reported him missing, but no one could explain where he had gone or why. As Emma read through the faded articles, her blood ran cold. One particular detail caught her eye, a description of Thomas's face. The article mentioned his dark, piercing eyes, his sharp nose, and the deeply etched lines of sorrow on his face. The exact same features as the face on their basement wall. Ben stared at the article, then looked back at Emma. His face was pale, his mouth dry. This can't be a coincidence, Emma. Emma nodded slowly, her heart racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but it didn't make sense. How could the face on the wall be connected to Thomas Holden? And why had it appeared after they moved in? They spent the next few days diving deeper into the house's history, uncovering more about Thomas Holden and his wife, who had died shortly after his disappearance. But no one seemed to know exactly what had happened to him. There were rumors, whispers about strange occurrences in the house, about unexplained noises, and about a dark, oppressive energy that seemed to cling to the walls. The more they uncovered, the more the stain on the wall seemed to call to them. It was no longer just a mark. It was a doorway, a window into something dark, something unresolved. The family became consumed with the mystery, unable to shake the feeling that Thomas's disappearance was linked to whatever was now watching them from the wall. The face wasn't just a face anymore. It was a message, and they were starting to realize, with growing terror, that the face was waiting for them to uncover its secrets. It was the dead of night when the noises started, slow, dragging, and faint at first. It was nothing more than a soft scratching at the wall, but it was enough to send Emma's blood running cold. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, listening as the sound grew louder, more frantic. Ben heard it too. He got up, his face grim, and went down to the basement, thinking it was just the house settling. But as soon as he stepped into the basement, the scratching grew louder, closer, as if something was trying to escape from the inside of the wall. Emma followed him, her hands trembling as she descended the stairs. The basement was colder now, the air thick with tension. As she entered, she froze in place. The face on the wall, the face was different. It was no longer just a silent, watching figure. The features had twisted, contorted into a grotesque mask of agony. The eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, were wide open in terror. And the mouth, it was now screaming. Emma gasped and stumbled back, horrified, her breath caught in her throat. Ben, too, recoiled. The air was so thick with dread, it felt like the walls themselves were closing in around them. The scratching continued, louder now, as if something was desperately trying to break free. With a surge of adrenaline, Ben grabbed a hammer and began smashing at the wall, his hands shaking with fear and determination. He hit it once, twice, and then, crack, the wall gave way, a jagged opening forming where the face had been. The air grew heavier, colder. The scratching intensified, frantic and relentless. Behind the wall, hidden in the darkness, was a small cavity, and within it, a sight that would haunt them forever. A skeleton, its bones brittle and yellowed with age, lay half exposed in the cramped space. Its arm was stretched out, fingers curled as if reaching for something or someone. But the most horrifying detail was the expression on its skull. The empty eye sockets seemed to stare at them, and the mouth, though silent, seemed to be frozen in a scream, as if the poor soul had died in the throes of desperation. Ben recoiled, his chest tightening with a wave of nausea. Emma's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. It was him, Thomas Holden, the missing man. His body had been trapped behind the wall for decades, his spirit now bound to the face that had begun to torment them. And the most terrifying part? The face had been waiting for them to uncover the truth. The scratching stopped, but the air was still heavy with an unshakable presence. The house was no longer just a home. It was a tomb, and the restless spirit of Thomas Holden would never let them forget. The air in the basement was suffocating, heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. Emma and Ben stood frozen, staring at the skeleton behind the wall, the realization sinking in that the missing man, Thomas Holden, had been trapped there, his soul forever bound to the house. But before they could process the horror, something far worse happened. The wall shifted. The face on the wall, the one that had haunted them for so long, began to warp and distort. The once mournful expression twisted into something far darker, far more malevolent. The features stretched unnaturally, the eyes widening until they seemed to bulge out of their sockets. The mouth, once silent and frozen, began to curl into a grotesque, twisted grin. The face grew larger, stretching across the wall as if trying to escape its prison. The air grew ice cold, and a low, guttural laugh echoed from deep within the walls, sending chills down their spines. It was the voice of Thomas Holden, but it was no longer his voice. It was dark, demonic, a sound that seemed to reverberate from the depths of hell itself. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the house seemed to come alive. The floors groaned under the weight of something shifting, something ancient awakening. The walls closed in on them, and the house felt like it was no longer a home. It was a creature, hungry and alive, ready to consume them whole. Emma grabbed Ben's arm, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to get out now," she screamed. But the door, the one that had always led to safety, was now sealed shut. It was as if the house had swallowed every escape route, trapping them inside. The face, no longer a mere stain, laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the rooms, reverberating off the walls with an almost physical force. The walls continued to close in, the suffocating laughter growing louder with each passing second. It was as if the very structure of the house had become a prison, a tomb with no way out. And the face of Thomas Holden, now seemed to stare at them, alive with rage and hunger. Ben tried to force the basement door open, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on it, his fists raw and bloodied. "It's no use," he shouted. "We're trapped." Emma's eyes darted around, panic rising within her chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and the walls pressed in closer. The house was suffocating them, the air thick with a stench of decay. The face on the wall, now a monstrous reflection of Thomas Holden's twisted spirit, laughed again. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. The couple's world had become a nightmare, and there was no way out. The laughter grew louder, louder still, until it was deafening. The walls squeezed tighter, and with a final, horrific scream, the house seemed to consume them, devour them. And as their cries were silenced, the face on the wall remained, still laughing, still watching, forever trapped in the walls of the farmhouse, waiting for its next victims.